Welcome to another Magic the Gathering video with November Lima. We are close to the Crimson Vow release, which is the second Innistrad set that we're getting in Standard right now. And with that, I have selected what I believe will be the top 10 cards in Standard. And with that being said, I feel really good about this list. I've gone about it very different than I have before. Previous sets, I would look at the cards individually, and here I've taken into consideration a whole lot more what I believe is the meta, will be the meta, and kind of how that'll shift. So as I go through these cards, I will share some of those thoughts that I had when selecting these. So with that being said, there is one thing that I'm sure a lot of you are watching this for, and that is, if I play Arena, what should I use my wildcards on? Like I said with previous set, I am skipping the lands in this top 10, but if you want to know what to use your wildcards on, this is what to use your wildcards on. We are getting what a lot of people refer to as the slow lands. We're getting the rest of the cycle. So after this, we'll have all color combinations of the 2-color combos. We have all of those in the slow lands, and I am super excited about that because these lands are fantastic. I've really enjoyed the ones that we got in Midnight Hunt, and I really think that with these additions, running 3 or maybe even 4-color decks is going to be a piece of cake. Right now, already running 3-color decks is a lot easier, but like one of the color combinations I absolutely love that has been kind of hard from a land standpoint is Mardu, and with Sundown Pass and Shattered Sanctum, that's going to be a whole lot easier to run. I'm also a Golgari fanatic, so Deathcap Glade's going to be fantastic. Either way, use all your wild cards on these first before you get to some of these other cards. And no further ado, let's just go ahead and get started with the list. So, as we're getting into the wedding of the century between Olivia and Edgar Markov, I think it is. Let's see what we have for number 10. Now, disclaimer as well, the number 10 is always the one that I struggle with the most. So there were a lot of cards that I was trying to see if it should be in the top 10. And a lot of cards just didn't cut it because they were either too niche and just didn't make enough of an impact. So I tried to go with some cards that are a little bit more flexible. And that's where Lantern Flare made the cut to the top 10. Lantern Flare is 1 and a white for an instant with a cleave effect. And I know a lot of you find cleave very difficult or complicated. Cleave is actually very simple. It's basically you either pay the cleave cost and you do not read anything that's in between the brackets, or you do not play the cleave cost. You pretend there's no cleave, you pretend there's no brackets. That's it. So I'm going to read it without the cleave cost first. 1 and a white, Lantern Flare deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control. I think this is a really great removal spell in aggro mirrors, or obviously if you play a life gain deck. White loves life gain, so if you play a white life gain deck, this is a fantastic removal spell for you. Being able to deal damage to a creature or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures you control and then gain that much life. That's a really nice bonus. Now, we already have spells like this where you deal X amount of damage based on the amount of creatures you have. One is the land in Zendikar Rising. That's a dual-faced modal card. But here you have it in an instant that also gains you some life. That makes it so much more valuable in the mirror and for life gain decks. Now, let's say you're not an aggro deck, and let's say you don't run a lot of creatures. You can also run this in like a Jeskai control list, by example, if you play the cleave cost, where you have X, a red, and a white, whereas you deal X damage to target creature or planeswalker and you gain X life. Because you play the cleave cost, you don't look at the stuff that's in between the brackets, so it doesn't have to do with the number of creatures you control. X is the amount that you pay. So let's say you sink 5 mana into this. That's basically a 5 mana, deal 3, gain 3. It's not a heroic, whatever you call it, that's in historic right now, but still it's flexible. That's what I like about it. I believe that if you play any white aggro deck of any way, or a mid-range creature-based deck with white, you're going to want this at least in your sideboard. Alright, let's go to the next one. We are hitting number 9. Number 9 is Overcharged Amalgam, or Amalgam. I have no idea how you pronounce it, so whichever. It's 2 blue and a blue for a creature zombie horror. It's a 3/3. It has Flash, Flying, and Exploit. When Overcharged Amalgam exploits a creature, counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. That is a lot happening. So there's a lot going for this card that make it great. First off, it's a 4/4, or it's a 4-mana 3/3 flyer with Flash. That's already good. It's great to put pressure on control decks. It's great to put pressure on creature decks that don't necessarily have a lot of flyers. Being that you can cast it on your opponent's end step really is nice. But what's so great about this is the exploitability, of course. So if you exploit it, which means that you sacrifice one of your creatures when you play this, being able to counter a spell, activated ability, or triggered ability is huge. We currently don't have something like this in Standard. We only have counter spells. We don't have activated or triggered ability counters. So this brings something to the format that we were missing since we lost Tail's End. With Tail's End being gone, this really takes that spot over. Being able to counter the trigger, so let's say, by example, your opponent -3s with Lolth, sacrificing their Lolth so they can get 2 spiders on the board. You play this, and you actually sacrifice one of your creatures and you counter their triggered ability, or activated ability, rather. Which means that they, even though they lost their Lolth, they're not getting their spiders. So there's things like that you can do with it. Also, the only thing where this won't really be a great card is in like control mirrors. I don't think people will want to play this because, again, you need creatures for the exploitability. But you'll see this in Dimir Zombie. This is an obvious inclusion. But also any blue tempo deck or anything that runs like the Wet Gruel, stuff like that. I could see this being a 1 or 2 off in those things in the sideboard. Double blue is a little painful if you just splash blue, but this card is worth it. Going to number 8. And for number 8, I've got a reprint. A Braid. 1 in red for an instant. Choose 1. It deals 3 damage to target creature, or you destroy target artifact. This is not an exciting card. This is not anything that we haven't seen before. Again, it's a reprint. But currently, this thing is a sideboard auto-inclusion in Historic, and it's going to be an auto-inclusion in Standard. If you run red, this is a very logical inclusion. Being able to deal 3 to a creature or destroying target artifact, that makes it, and at instant speed, makes it so much better than a Rip Apart. The only downside this card truly has, and that's really the only one, is that it doesn't deal damage to Planeswalkers. But we are not in a very Planeswalker-heavy Standard. Sure, we've got the most strong Planeswalkers we have right now are Lolth, Arlinn, Wrenn, and I think those are pretty much the strong ones. Now, sure, you got Professor Onyx. Doesn't see a lot of play right now. You've got Mordekainen. Doesn't see a lot of play. Kaya, you've got 2 of them now. The new one that's coming with Vow, and you've got the old one. I don't know if either one of those will see that much play. Chandra looks good in mono red, but I don't know how much play it'll see. In reality, most of your removal will be creature based. With mono or with red, most of the 2-drop or 2-mana removal spells are 3 damage. So why not tack one on that can destroy artifacts? This is just too good of a removal spell. Going to number 7. Thorns, Fist of the Angels. 1 green-white for legendary creature, Human Cleric. It's a 2/2. And it has Training. Training is a new ability that we're seeing in this set. Training, whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So Training is basically your reversed Mentor, where if you attack with a creature with Training, as long as another creature is stronger in power, and they attack as well, you put a +1/+1 counter on your creature. This thing gets a little out of hand, though. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 green and white human soldier creature token with Training. So anytime you cast a creature spell and you have this on the board, you create one of those tokens that can also get bigger really quickly if you attack with it and a stronger creature. So it really is a very powerful token generator, probably one of the stronger ones we've seen here lately, that is low in mana cost, incredibly efficient, and can get stronger itself as well. Overall, a fantastic card, and I think that this card by itself already makes Celestia Human so much better. I'm really excited about this card, and I will be playing this a lot for sure. Also, it's in a very, very important um, type. It's a cleric, so Abzan clerics is also very much something that can be played. It's not top tier yet, but it includes in there as well. So overall, there's really nothing bad to say about this card. Let's go to number 6. For number 6, we have Maniform Hellkite. Maniform Hellkite is 2 a red and red for a creature dragon. That's a 4/4 with flying. So 4/4 flying dragons for 4 mana is something that we see almost every set. But this one has a really nutty ability, if you will. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX red dragon illusion creature token with flying and haste, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. That is a crazy aggressive ability. So I could see this going in like your Izzet Epiphany decks, where you put a couple Maniform Hellkites in there just to put extra pressure on your opponent. In the control mirrors for Izzet, this thing is going to be a beast. Playing this and then doing like a Divide by Zero or a Fading Hope, draw a couple cards, whatever you want to do. You pay a couple mana, and the amount of mana you cast is a flying creature that you can send at your opponent to do damage with. It gets out of hand really, really quickly. It's an incredibly powerful burn card, but also not even just in a Izzet. I can see this going in like a mono red deck or in like, trying to think, any like treasure mid-range kind of decks where you play plenty of non-creature spells. Non-creature spells also like a planeswalker, so imagine playing this and then on turn 5 you play like Lolth, by example. That also puts a 5/5 flyer on the board with haste that you can attack your opponent with. This thing is super, super strong, incredibly aggressive, and I can imagine this going to be a nightmare to see on the board for a lot of players. All right, so we've seen some super powerful cards already, and we're getting further down the list. So let's go to number 5. Number 5, Washaway. For a blue, we've got an instant. It has a cleave ability, but first let's see what it does for just a blue. For blue, counter target spell that wasn't cast from its owner's hand. So for 1 blue, we already have a counter spell that can only counter cards that are not cast from hand. So think anything that's foretold, Alden's Epiphany, Saw It Coming, Behold the Multiverse. Those are all cards that are being played from foretold most often than not. So they're getting played from exile. Doomscar is another one that we see often played from exile. Think of your distorted cards like Memory Deluge. Memory Deluge is a big one. Let's say your opponent sinks 7 mana into a Memory Deluge to play it from its graveyard, and you pay 1 blue to counter it. That's incredibly solid tempo play, and it's going to hurt, especially going to hurt control decks a lot. I put this at number 5, not because in itself is incredibly powerful, because there's a lot of really powerful cards we've already seen, but simply because of how often I think this will see play. Every control deck running blue will have this in the sideboard because it is so strong against other control decks. Depending on how the meta will shift, you might see this in regular main decks as well. Think of Mystical Dispute. This has a lot of the Mystical Dispute vibe to me because right now control decks play a lot from exile and graveyard. Washaway is a perfect counter for it. Now, if you play the Cleave cost, which is 1 a blue and a blue, then it's just a counter spell. So it's like cancel, if you will. Still good. That's why I think this could very well be main deck card, because you can still pay the 3 mana to counter, which makes it slightly less than some other counters we have. But just the Washaway ability of the 1 blue to counter an Alden's Epiphany from exile, Doomscar, Behold the Multiverse, all those really good cards makes this incredibly powerful. Yeah, control players are going to hate and love this card depending on who has it. So let's get into the next one. For number 4, Ascendant Pack Leader. Ascendant Pack Leader is 1 grief for the creature wolf. That's a 2/1. Ascendant Pack Leader enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if you control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Ascendant Pack Leader. This is so strong and so needed. Now, don't get me wrong, mono green is strong enough, but think about mono green, werewolves, whether it's like Gruul, Jund, whatever it is. Think of your like mid-range builds that run green. Um, any aggro or even mid-range decks that run green have been missing a really strong one-drop creature. Honestly, ever since Belt Collector rotated out, we have not seen a strong one-mana creature in green. Ascendant Pack Leader fills that void and in such an amazing way. If you have a 4-mana permanent on the board, this comes in as a 3/2 for only 1 mana. Even a 2/1 for 1 mana is already pretty solid. Think of your Usher of the Fallen. But coming in and possibly really easily growing to a 3/2. Let's be honest. Getting a 3/2 on the board with this is pretty easy. If you play it late in the game, it doesn't feel bad because it's still big. And as you play bigger spells, it gets bigger. That's what's so strong about this. If you go back in time, I'm not going to say this is better than Pelt Collector. It's different. But let's compare it to Pelt Collector. You play Pelt Collector on turn 1, fantastic. You play Pelt Collector on turn 6 or 7, meh, doesn't feel so good. Play this on turn 6 or 7, followed by you already have a Chariot on the board or a Ren in 7 or whatever it is, Arlen, and you play another Asika Chariot or Ren or Arlen or any of those things after this. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. What's nice about this too is that you don't necessarily have to have something that keeps getting stronger to make this stronger. Anytime you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you put a counter on this. No matter how big this thing already is, it just keeps getting bigger. For 1 mana. Value Town. This thing is fantastic. This thing fills a very important void. I imagine Mono Green will play this as an auto inclusion. Werewolves will play this as an auto inclusion, and a lot of other green based decks will play this as an auto inclusion. This card is fantastic. Now, what could possibly be above that? Now, granted, I've been going back and forth whether or not I should flip these two, but I decided to stick with it. Number 3, Allenbach Escort. Allenbach Escort is another 1-drop. It's a 1/1 and has Vigilance. Sacrifice Allenbach Escort to target creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on against lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. These cards are historically really, really good. I could go back and forth between this one and the Ascendant Pack Leader, which should be ahead of the other one. But what I love so much about this one, it's not as good as Selfless Savior, but giving it something lifelink is really relevant. It gives lifelink decks something really powerful, and this is also a cleric, so it fits really well in lifelink decks. Any creature-based deck has a very easy time putting counters on itself, on its creatures now. So think of Mono White with Luminarch Aspirant. Think of any deck that runs adversaries. Those things give each themselves counters. A lot of cards entering the format will have training. There's just so many ways to get counters. Think of the Ascendant Pack Leader. That's another one with a counter. So if you play a Celestia aggro deck or Naya aggro deck, you can protect your Ascendant Pack Leader with Allenbach Escort. There's just a lot of creatures that very easily get some counters on it, and being able to make it indestructible by sacrificing creature. We saw Selfless Savior. It's just very, very powerful, very, very annoying, and really hard to deal with. What is so great about this one is it makes blocking even more interesting, because you really have to think, if you're in the aggro mirror, how you want to block and how you want to fight because of the lifelink. Giving a creature indestructible and lifelink can really put you ahead against aggro decks. So overall, really interesting card. I think this will see a ton of play simply because of the flexibility and how easy it is to put +1/+1 counters on creatures. Alright, we're down to the last two. This one I find very interesting, but also another card that we've historically just seen be good in general. We've got Reckless Impulse, and it's a common on number 2. I know, I'm insane. It's a 1 and a red for a sorcery. Exile the top cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. Cards like this just do really well. It's a great tempo play, it's great card advantage, and it's cheap. So, why I like this. There's two cards that this reminds me of. One that we currently have in Standard, an Expressive Iteration. Expressive Iteration lets you, for a red and a blue, lets you look at the top three, put one in your hand, one in exile to play that turn, and one back in your deck. And then it reminds me a lot of Light Up the Stage. Light Up the Stage was the mono red card that lets you put tempo in mono red. Without Light Up the Stage, mono red was not nearly as powerful. This reminds me a lot of that. I don't think it's as good as Light Up the Stage, but it is different. It could be good in different aspects. Where Light Up the Stage was only good if you could cast it for one, that meant that you had to do damage, because otherwise it was 3 mana, and that was just too much. So you had to do damage to activate Light Up the Stage for it to be effective. Then with Expressive Iteration, you have to play blue. If you don't play blue, you don't play Expressive Iteration. Simple. You can't pay for it. And also, Expressive Iteration also gives you 2 cards, but it's 2 out of 3, so you get to pick 2 out of the top 3. Here, you just get the top 2. However, it's a lot easier to get to. You only need 1 red mana and then 1 of whatever color, whether that's another red, whether that's a Field of Ruin, doesn't matter. You can play this, and then you exile the top 2 cards of your library. Typically, where you'll want to play this is at your end step, and then you'll just have access to those cards, or not end step, but at your second main, so that way you have access to those cards on your next turn. That is a great tempo play. So I really think mono red's going to be a thing this after this set. I also think that a lot of red-based aggro decks are going to want to play this just for the increased tempo. Because right now, the biggest problem for aggro decks, a lot of them have a good advantage against the Epiphany decks. However, the moment you run out of steam is when the Epiphany decks just completely take over, because you just cannot get back on speed. Now, if you have a Reckless Impulse, you can kind of recreate some of that tempo. So I think this card's going to see a lot of play. I think it's really powerful, and I think it's super flexible, and that's why I like it, having it on the number 2. So far, we have had some really powerful cards that can make big impacts in the various meta decks, that can support some new top tier decks, and some very flexible cards. Some really solid reprints. So what would be on number 1? On number 1, I have another reprint, and you might already see this one coming. Number 1, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. I chose Thalia. Let's read it first, sorry. 1 and a white for legendary creature human soldier that's a 2/1 with first strike. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Why I chose this is, first, we see how powerful it is in Historic and how powerful it used to be whenever it was in Standard. This card puts a lot of pressure on control decks. But what I love about this is, again, like I said before, it's very easy to put +1/+1 counters on things. So First Strike is really good in aggro mirrors. Being able to block or attack without having to worry about losing the exchange. But also, if I look at some of the cards that it might go up against, so Thalia I'll see that play in Celestia Humans, Mono White, and potentially Boros, but probably not Boros as much because they do have more non-creature spells. But Celestia Humans and Mono White both do not rely on a lot of non-creature spells, so they don't suffer as much of Thalia when they play it. Now go up against like a Mono Green, which is a hard matchup. Blizzard Brawl is a lot less good for 2 mana. It's still a fantastic spell, but the tempo play of the 1 mana Blizzard Brawl becoming a 2 mana, that puts them behind. Whereas otherwise Blizzard Brawl is a huge advantage to play on curve. So you put your Werewolf on the board, and then turn 3 you just smoke your opponent. Or if you have a Jesper Sentinel on the board, you can do it on turn 2. Put a 3/3 on the board and destroy your opponent's creature with Blizzard Brawl. Now having Thalia on the board, you slow him down. Thalia is also incredible against control. Izzet Epiphany decks are going to already have a hard time at mono white. Imagine including Thalia in the mix. So control decks are going to struggle with some of these taxes that mono white especially brings, and Thalia brings a lot more to that. So overall, I think Thalia is going to be fantastic and see a lot of play, and be a very, very important factor on shaping the meta as it develops. So that's my top 10. However, I do want to say I have one more card I want to show you guys, and that's a card that probably didn't even make my top 20, but I'm just super excited about the card, so I'm going to show it to you anyway. First off, thank you so much for hearing me talk about the cards that I believe are top 10. I really appreciate it, just like the lady in the picture. It gives me the warm and fuzzies, like a little warm blanket, if you will. Let me know what you think in the comments. I always like to hear your thoughts. I'm sure there are cards where you're like, why didn't you include those? I'm happy to talk about them. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. There might be certain things that I've thought about that I think are valid reasons to keep them out. I love discussing this stuff. Anyway, another great way to follow me is on my Twitter, so check it out. You got the Twitter handle right there. Also, without further ado, let's go into my kind of like honorable mention, if you will. Typically, my honorable mention should be like close to the top 10. That's why it's an honorable mention. This one is just because I don't think it is a top tier card in any way, shape, or form, but it's just super fun. And if it actually makes it on the board against creature decks, it is a nightmare. Toxrill the Corrosive. Toxrill the Corrosive, 5 of black and a black for a legendary creature, Slug Horror. It's a 7/7. At the beginning of each end step, put a slime counter on each creature you don't control. Creatures you don't control get a -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. Whenever a creature you don't control with a slime counter on it dies, create a 1/1 black slug creature token. For blue and black, sacrifice a slug and draw a card. I love -1/-1 effects. You've probably already noticed this if you've seen videos of me prior, if you've seen me on Twitter. Some of my best favorite cards in Magic the Gathering have those kinds of effects, but this one just does it so powerful. This thing is so strong. Being able to just every end step put -1/-1s on your opponent, and the moment they die because of it, you get slugs in exchange. You can sacrifice them for card draw. This thing is a house, and it's really cool. It is disgusting. It is scary. It is everything I love on a Magic card. So there's that. I'll probably build some kind of funky Sultai ramp deck that has this at the top end for the creature decks. Probably in the sideboard because against control, this thing is horrible. But other than that, I'm really excited about this card. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in some gameplay videos coming up. Thanks.